I will please welcome to the roundtable Vincent Larivière. We also have Vicky Molakiewicz, who is at a distance, and we have Ophélie Fraisier-Vannier and Nick Wise. So, Vincent Larivière, so you made a long trip to come over here. So you're professor at l'Université de Montréal. You're full professor, and you hold the UNESCO chair in open science. You're a scientific director at the Érudit journal platform, and your research activity focus on the characteristics of the Quebec, Canadian, and global research systems, and on the transformation of this research system with respect to the open science on one side and AI on the other side. And you'll be talking to us about this exactly, talking about the whole impact of AI on the whole process of writing and publishing papers. Vicky Molaki, do you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. We don't see you, but yet we see you in a moment. So you're a scientific associate to the Hellenic National Commission for Bioethics and Technoethics. You've been appointed as external ethics expert in the European Commission, where you carry out ethics evaluation for the European Research Programme. And you're a member of the Research Ethics Committee of the Euro University. And that's it. And Ophélie, you're here. So you're postdoctoral researcher in computer science at the Université de Toulouse. And you are investigating misuse of AI in producing papers, and you will instruct us about that. And following your Nick Wise, so you're in Taylor and Francis. And well, you were working on this kind of thing, on misuse, and you were integrated to Taylor and Francis to track and we'll see how you deal with this kind of thing within an editor. That's right? All right, thanks. So thank you very much. When you ask questions, so you see you have French-speaking and less French-speaking speakers, so you can ask your question in French or English, as you wish. And now the floor is yours, Vincent.
Écoutez, merci beaucoup de l'invitation. Je vais parler en anglais. Et ce n'était pas certain pour moi si on préférait que je parle en anglais à cause de mon accent québécois ou c'était...
As you wish.
Donc voilà, donc ce sera en anglais. So I'll talk about generative AI, research evaluation, and scholarly communication. Okay, this is working. So I'll start by just lay out, just in history, a couple of the innovations that happened in scholarly communication. Then, in order to start to talk about AI and scholarly communication, we need to re-emphasize the place of publishing in the current scientific system, where I would believe it has taken probably too much importance, and AI will make it even worse from my point of view. So I'm just laying the ground for a few things I was going to say. Then we'll discuss about generative AI and basically 4 aspects of the scholarly communication ecosystem where we believe there are problems, and trying to see whether AI can actually help solve some of those things, or it will, as I unfortunately mentioned earlier, make things perhaps a bit worse. So, of course, scholarly communication evolved from something that was, let's say, one-to-one in the antiquity, where, well, a couple of treaties were written, but mostly correspondence between scientists. Then in the Middle Ages, writing letters to each other kind of became something a bit more formal. And then we had copies, which in a way, pseudo-technological innovation, having people rewrite the ancient text. Then one could say the first major innovation is, of course, the printing press, where it basically made the dissemination of monographs much faster and disseminated science, let's say, at much higher distances. Then, about 360-something years ago, scientific societies, which were a new organization for scientists, developed what is perhaps, well, it's an innovation that still exists today, which is scientific and scholarly journals, which were created, if we are politically correct, simultaneously in the United Kingdom and in France. Of course, you have a different view than most of the world on that, I think. But basically, 360-something years ago, 2 journals were more or less created simultaneously. And the beauty of scholarly journals is that it indeed allowed for relatively fast dissemination of research findings to various communities. Then fast forward 340-ish years with the creation of the web and electronic journals, which led to an exponential increase, or actually continued the exponential increase in the number of journals, and also led, if we talk about the open access part, and let's say the bad open access part of science, which is that we now have journals that don't have readers anymore. They only have authors who are willing to pay to be published. And now we're moving on to a new revolution, which is generative AI and, well, a couple of those things, which we will get to in a couple of minutes. But before that, we need to, again, remember the crazy part that publishing is taken in our current academia. And listening to a couple of the talk from this morning, which were actually very good, in some ways, AI can indeed help advance knowledge, but it leads to issues in dissemination. And many of these issues are actually associated with scholarly publishing. So publishing now is crucial. If you don't publish as a scientist, or now even as a student, you don't exist. We're showing undergrad students how to publish. Undergrad students know that impact factor exists, which they should not be caring about impact factors at all. So we need to publish to signal that we are doing research. We need to publish not to disseminate what we found, but just to say, hey, I exist, I'm still there in the system. And it's really interesting to contrast that with, well, older colleagues of ours, like Peter Higgs, who published his last paper in 1979, basically quite early in his career. And Higgs considered that he created his theoretical apparatus. He did not need to publish an additional paper, which would make a minor tweak to make sure that people knew who he was. And of course, he continued to contribute to science in different ways, but stopped publishing. And this is something that we probably need to think a bit about. Again, it reminds us that you don't cure cancer or COVID or win a Nobel because you have an H-index of 300. You just need one major discovery to change the face of humanity. And of course, the context, we all know it. Research evaluation, bibliometrics, which in some parts of the world have replaced peer review. They form the basis of most university rankings. Those university rankings lead to university mergers, as you know, in France. They have not affected us as much, I believe, in Canada or in Quebec, but it's still part of the general discussion about universities. Let's say that my institution has a poor rank from some self-proclaimed ranker of university. My president has to go on the news to defend the fact that we decreased in a ranking that has not really a really good purpose in science or society. And of course, the most crazy example are all of the cash per publication policies, which exist in many parts of the world, in Europe, but also and mostly in Asia, where if you publish a paper in Science or Nature, it leads to a cash bonus, so that kind of a salary addition that goes close to 100,000 euros. So it's quite a lot of money that scientists get. So that's kind of a context where the things are not going so great. Adding some AI to that, will that improve or not? We'll see. So I'll start by AI in scientific production. I'll be quite fast on that because this is something that has been covered very well by my colleagues before. But what I find most interesting there is of course, the AI capacity to generate original content. Nature published a couple of years ago, and this is a citation. So basically, by tuning human-aware AI, we can generate scientifically promising alien hypotheses unlikely to have been imagined, which all promise to punctuate scientific advances beyond question currently pursued. So really having the AI determine advances, which leads to kind of a science without scientists. So listening to Thomas before, I was, of course, horrified like all of us, but it's also thinking that you have a paper written by AI, reviewed by AI, and then summarized by AI and read by no one, human, you know? So it's kind of a bit crazy, but there's genuine scientific advances. AlphaFold, one of many examples, which won the Nobel Prize, and a Nobel Prize that was awarded very fast, contrary to what currently happens with a 20, 30 years lag between discovery and Nobel Prize. This took only a couple of years. And again, plenty of good examples earlier this morning. So of course, AI can generate text. This is something that's quite obvious, but the thing is that historically, writing the paper is part of science. And I was, again, thinking about what Nicolas was talking this morning. It's as if AI will remove all of the fun. from science. Doing science is good. It's something that's fun. That's why many of us do it, not only because of the outputs and the papers we're going to generate. So I can, of course, generate text, synthesize text. It can analyze data, generate programming code. This is something that most labs use at some point. Figures and image generation. And I was surprised. I wasn't sure I would put that image in my talk because I thought everyone would use it. But that's a AI-generated image that got published into a paper published by a publisher, which is a fully 100% open access, which is one that is a bit on the frontiers of things, I would say. So basically, of course, it's a totally bogus image. There's another one with a rat that you may have seen, but I didn't have the guts to put it. But anyways, it brings a lot of integrity issues about, of course, attribution. Historically, humans write papers, humans do discovery. How do we attribute those discoveries to people? I will insist on overproduction, okay? So this is the curve of the numbers of papers published every year. We've went from less than 1 million 40-something years ago to more than 7 million in the last couple of years. And you see this little gap is the increase between pre-COVID and post-COVID. So there really is more and more paper published. That curve does not follow the curve of the number of scientists. The number of scientists is much more like that. Of course, China leads to an increase, but not as sharp as this one, which means that scientists are producing more and more papers individually. In a context where I would believe that it's more and more difficult to find original stuff, we're publishing more and more. And of course, this leads to major issues with peer review. I don't know if there's reviewers in the room or there's journal editors in the room, but historically, to get a reviewer, you would need to have, to get 2 reviewers, you would need to ask basically 4 people. 1 out of 2 would say, yes, I'm willing to do it. But now everyone is either too busy writing their own papers or too busy reviewing all of the papers that are published. So this exponential increase leads in many ways to a, let's say, lower evaluation of those scientific papers. So major issue with overproduction. Transparency, of course, is something that everyone says. We need to be transparent about our use of AI. I'm pretty sure that all of us in the room have used AI in some capacity in some of our papers. Just to check, probably just a handful of us have written transparently that we've used AI, because there's still a stigma associated with that. I don't necessarily have a solution to that, but saying that we should doesn't mean that we will. And so far, we're kind of stuck in this little issue. So AI quite likely to make us write more and more papers, which already right now we're unable to evaluate properly. And this also strengthens, of course, the place of commercial publishers in the ecosystem, because they will say, yeah, sure, we're going to create journals for you, which means more APCs to pay and less money to actually do research. So think about it. We're already spending a lot of money of our research funding to pay APCs instead of paying our students and paying new researchers. Okay, now I'm shifting to something slightly more positive. So over the last couple of decades, we shifted from a relatively multilingual scientific space to a mono-English language scientific space. Nowadays, there's about 10 to 15% of all papers that are published in languages other than English. So everyone converged to writing scientific papers in English. The Chinese write more scientific papers in English than they do in Chinese. And that's an issue. Maybe some of you would not agree, but it's an issue for equalities of chances for most people in the scientific system. And it also leads to some kind of a converging way of doing science, which is not so good for diversity. So AI tools have been shown to actually, we're not there yet, but we can get closer to having a scientific ecosystem where anyone can write their papers in the language that they want, and anyone can read the papers in the language that they want. That's a goal that I believe is attainable. So far, we're still having issues. There's many studies that have been done in France that shows that we're not there yet. But I think technically, this is something that is likely to happen. Of course, we need to solve the issue of the impact factor and all of these research evaluation indicators. But if we obliterate that element from a purely functional point of view, we could move to a multilingual system. but it could also lead to, and this is something that's already happening, to just improving the English language of everyone's papers, because these algorithms are actually relatively good for doing that. So this is something that is, I believe, positive, and that can lead to positive outcomes for the scientific community. Now, in terms of technical dissemination, there's, of course, the metadata quality. We've shifted in the world of both research evaluation and, let's say, information retrieval from having relatively smaller databases that overemphasize English language papers to having databases that were much more inclusive. And this is what you kind of see in the little figure here. That's the proportion of papers that are covered by commercial publishers in the Web of Science, which is, again, a restrictive database, from an inclusive database like Dimensions, which tries to index everything. And basically, what Data and Dimensions shows is that corporate publishers actually take a smaller and smaller share of the output because we now have good tools to create our own journals. So I believe that these algorithms, and again, I'm taking AI in a very general, with a very general definition here, I admit, but basically it can help automatize the creation of our scientific paper. I'm talking about the technical component where you guys send your Word document or your PDF or your LaTeX to the publisher, and then it makes a paper out of it. Now, these tools are, we can develop tools. We have tools to do that in a much faster manner and a much more efficient manner, which kind of reduces our dependency on these corporate publishers. And this would contribute to the sustainability of a diamond open access ecosystem where universities and research centers can gain back control over scholarly journal. Because if you remember, when electronic journals arrived, many small organizations just gave their journals to corporate publishers because they were the one who knew how to disseminate that electronically. We can gain back those scholarly journals. So I believe this is also something that would be relatively positive from a dissemination point of view. However, if it helps legitimate publishers create papers, it also helps predatory publishers to create papers. So we need to remember what the social conditions under which these predatory publishers were created. So of course, the pressures to publish that we all have. Now it's easy to create electronic journals, and as I mentioned earlier, you can have journals without having readers, which is something quite fascinating, I believe. Our funders also accepted that it was fine for us to use our funding to pay for publishing. This is something that could have been perhaps more stringent. And of course, the fact that everyone converges to English means that a predatory publisher doesn't have to create 50 journals to cover 50 languages in a given topic, but it can create only one, and then it's going to attract papers from pretty much everywhere. But their challenge there is really to attract authors, which in some way means they need to attract money. So they need to show that their journals are dynamic, that they receive submission, that there's a community around them. And what can AI do? Well, it actually create that community. So I'll show you an example of how they were doing it before. So historically, what they were doing was basically copy-pasting content in legitimate journal, and that's the case here, into their illegitimate journal. But in order not to be caught with, let's say, copyright problems, they were using, let's say, kind of automatic translations tool to translate the paper from English to French and then from French to another language, just to modify some of the text so that it would not be detected. So these added papers kind of showed that the journal was used by legitimate authors. But it's interesting because it did add, and this is from a couple of years ago, kind of these early hallucinations that we're seeing today. And I think you probably can see it. And my favorite of all of these hallucinations, and the red and the black are basically the changes, what the AI changes have made to the original legitimate paper. And you look at something like standard deviation here, which was replaced by Mount Rushmore State, which is, of course, South Dakota. And then you see that data is replaced with knowledge and a couple of things like that. So again, AI will make that probably worse because it's even easier to create these scientific papers, which now we move to knowledge discovery. All of the information retrieval, discoverability that was mentioned earlier this morning. So now we're able to index much more papers in databases that are those that I mentioned earlier. You kind of see that one follows the increase of the number of papers, and the Web of Science indexes a smaller and smaller share of things that are being published. We are getting to better information retrieval algorithm, but those still embed the biases that exist in the system and the markers of excellence that we rely on. So of course, papers published with higher impact factors will be higher in the algorithms. And all of these structural inequalities are still a bit of a problem. We also have tools nowadays that are actually using contextual citations. So basically, you are looking at, you have something that you're searching for, and you want to find papers that actually show that phenomena. Well, these tools allow you to find papers that actually make specific claims, which of course may be a bit more problematic. So it kind of gives us some contextual citation information. So I know time flies. Let's move on to research evaluation. And I'm afraid I don't have much good things to say on that. So of course, we've mentioned earlier the issue of peer review, and there's a major element that was said by Thomas at the end, which is of course the fact that if I'm asking ChatGPT to make a peer review of a grant proposal, for instance, it means that I need to upload the grant proposal to ChatGPT, and in most cases, these proposals are confidential. So most funders, and it's actually the case of Canada, they made that illegal to actually upload these proposals. So they say the usage of ChatGPT or any generative AI to make peer review is totally forbidden. Now, in terms of quantitative research evaluation, there's one positive element that these tools can lead to, which is that they lead to better coverage. So if you want to assess or just compile very simply the number of papers published in France, typically, well, most databases will not cover papers published in France, in French. But these things are changing, and now we can have a more comprehensive coverage of all of those papers, so a better coverage of otherwise, let's say, excluded geographical or linguistic spaces. So that's a relatively positive thing. We can move to things that are a bit more precise, understanding citation context and citation location. So in the new version of the Web of Science, you're now able to look at where a specific paper is going to be cited. And this is the typical curves of where papers are cited. So papers that are highly cited, where are they typically cited in the citing papers? Well, it's going to be in the introduction, because this is where you just dump basically papers there to show that you've read and that you know about a couple of things. So if you are being cited there, it's great, but it doesn't mean the same level of engagement than if you are cited in the discussion and conclusion, which is where, in many ways, the genuine scientific discussion will be developed. So this is an interesting addition, although, and I'll get back to that later, I don't think more data means better outcome, but I'll get back to that later. Then, of course, there's another addition there, which is, are papers cited positively or negatively? This is, I believe, an interesting scientific question, but from a research evaluation point of view, the vast majority of papers are cited positively. So basically, negative citations account for about 1 citation out of 300, because typically when a paper is cited negatively, it kind of stops being cited afterwards. So it's a very tiny proportion of papers that are cited this way. It's interesting to see the discrepancy between disciplines, where social scientists are much more likely to argue between each other, and math and computer science, well, basically 10 times less likely to have negative citations. But I must say that when they cite negatively, mathematicians and computer scientists are a bit more harsh. They say things like, it is false, you are wrong. While social scientists are a bit more, it's controversial and stuff like that. So the way things happen was a bit interesting. But the point there is that we probably don't need all of these tools. But before going there, just maybe one quick thing. There's tools that allow us to go beyond traditional citation. So looking at whether papers are cited in policy documents, are they cited on social media or what remains of social media. So all of the altmetric world, for those of you who remember that, is kind of dead. But it's interesting that there's maybe something there, but in order to have real markers of impact, there's going to need to be platform changes and new adoption of new platform. So to conclude, what is AI solving, or at least contributing to solve? So I believe it can improve information retrieval, new ways to process scientific documents. It may contribute to establishing a genuine multilingual research ecosystem. There's one thing that it won't solve, because there's two reasons why scientists have converged into English. There's, of course, the fact that English is the common language for many people, which leads to a functional use of English. But there's also the symbolic use of English, which AI doesn't solve. And by symbolic, I mean there's two French people writing in a French journal, but they will do it in English because it's more prestigious. And we would do the same in Quebec also. So this is a use which I believe is a bit more problematic, in which AI does not solve because it's a sociological problem. It could contribute to more of a fair and community-led open access dissemination ecosystem by making the creation of journals much more cheap, and perhaps lead to new forms of symbolic capital that go beyond the traditional journal impact factor. But there's many things that it's not solving, and there's many things that it actually makes worse. That's my last slide, so I'm on time. So it's going to lead to an exponential increase of the already exponential increase of research papers, which is already unsustainable. It makes scientific papers less relevant. And I believe that's a genuine problem, and probably the worst of all of those problems. It's also very interesting that there's authorship criteria that a couple of organizations have put forward. One of them is the International Committee of International, it's medical journal editor. It's not twice international. That would be very international. Which is that in order to be an author, you need to have contributed to the writing of the paper. If you have not written, you're not an author. Now we're actually having the writing made by an AI who's not even an author. So all of these things need to, of course, be totally reconfigured. It's going to lead to more papers in predatory journals, which will emerge from the publishers themselves to kind of show that there's activity in there. And globally, in terms of research evaluation, I don't think more numbers will help. I don't think more sophisticated numbers will help. We need to slow down the publishing system and go back to more qualitative and human research evaluation. I'll stop on that. Thank you very much.
So I've noted that you talked a lot about evaluation, and a link with what was said this morning on project was AI brings, to my opinion, to my understanding, it brings us back to the very nature of our job. What do we have to do? So I know that we have the risk of having journals without authors, no readers. That's what I understood. All right. So you talk also about the risk on peer review. So we now have, thanks to Vicky, a deep dive on peer review and AI. So the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also not happy for not being there, but I hope that I can contribute to this very interesting discussion. My intervention focuses more on the use of AI tools in the peer review process. We are all aware of the importance of the peer review process because all studies and research is actually set to the judgment of expert peers to critically assess their novelty, quality and impact of the specific research which is being assessed. And we, as already heard, we are witnessing an increasing use of AI tools at different stages of science and also during the peer review process. Now, AI tools do have advantages. For example, they can enable editors to save a lot of time in quite tedious tasks, but also enables reviewers to generate more concise and well-written peer review reports, especially for the non-native English speakers. And it definitely helps the authors at least in certain cases. For example, it can enhance and speed up academic writing, although, as we have heard, this is open to judgment, of course. But this issue of whether AI tools can be actually an author, or whether we can use AI tools even to write parts of manuscripts, has been more or less widely discussed in the literature. And indeed, there are quite a lot of ethical issues related to authorship, authenticity, etc. The fact that this has been widely discussed is actually mirrored in the policies of large publishers. These data are taken from a publication in January 2024, so they might be a bit out of date. But we see that most large publishers do have a clear policy on whether AI-based tools should be used by authors. When this is done, it should be disclosed, and most of the publishers also refer to the Committee on Publication Ethics Guidelines and or the World Association of Medical Editors guidelines. However, a less discussed issue is whether peer reviewers can use AI tools and whether there are any appropriate policies to address such an issue. Having a look at the same large publishers, you will see that only 2 of them actually have a policy on the use of AI-based tools by reviewers. Elsewhere is based on the fact that if we upload manuscripts, these might contain confidential information and even private personal data of research participants. So on that basis, this is not encouraged. And Taylor and Francis clearly states that reviewers must not use AI tools such as X and Z. So why are we discussing this? What are the risks of using AI tools for manuscript reviewing? There have been several papers published showing that there are different risks. And these risks also vary in nature. So, for example, the study by Donker showed that ChatGPT does not propose any specific improvements for manuscripts. There is no critical content. Sometimes there are specific looking general comments which might be actually confusing. And even references were fabricated, talking about hallucinations actually earlier. So he argues that authors should be prepared to challenge reviewer comments that seem unrelated and non-specific. And in another study where an AI tool was actually developed for that specific purpose, to check on whether such an AI tool can be a reviewer similar to a human reviewer, it was found that indeed there was an alignment between the result that was reached by a human reviewer and from the AI tool. However, such AI tools that were reviewing paper had also the possibility of propagating biases that exist in the training data, which came from human reviewers, such as the so-called first impression bias. And of course, something which is already heard even by the previous speaker, if you think about it, the peer review reports that can be generated by AI tools can be a tool that is used by predatory journals for fake peer reviews. So there are voices which are increasing in the literature about the need for consistent end-to-end policies, not just for the peer reviewers, but throughout the whole process of the peer review. And adding on top of that, of course, there is the risk of editors or reviewers over-relying on AI tools, overlooking their own expert judgment, and consequently, authors may actually distrust the whole process of the peer review, exactly because there is a lack of transparency and sometimes there is a lack of the rationale behind the decision taken for a manuscript. So ultimately, when AI tools are used in the peer review process, that might undermine the integrity and the purpose of the peer review. So according to the tables that I presented earlier, policies for the use of AI tools by authors are restrictive, and I pretty much guess that even for the publishers that they do not have such policies in place yet, they will have restrictive policies for the use of AI tools by reviewers. But the real question is, are policies enough, and what steps should we take further to make sure that these policies are being followed? So imagine that some authors, a group of authors, suspect that a reviewer has used AI tools to produce a review report. What should they do? Normally, they alert the editors and they raise such matters to the journal's ethics committee, always assuming that one exists, because this is not always the case. Now, the real issue here is that there is a lack of evidence to prove or not prove that such allegations are true. So we should go some steps beyond policies and make sure that there are certain procedures in place that will facilitate decision-making when a reviewer is found or suspected to have used AI tools. So one possible solution to this would be that we should use AI detection tools, not just to screen the manuscripts and check whether they have been authored by AI, but also to use such tools to detect peer review reports. Of course, I can hear the argument that if we use such tools for the peer review reports, this might undermine the altruism on which the peer review is based on, and it creates challenges because it challenges the trust between reviewers and editors. However, this lack of evidence should be somehow backed up in order to reach rigid decisions when there are certain allegations.
I'm sorry, we have 2 minutes left. Thanks.
Thanks. So if the use of AI tools in peer review reports cannot be proven, this might be actually detrimental for the whole ethics in publishing, and it will also add on existing criticism on the peer review process, things that we're all aware of about delays, potential bias, etc. So if reviewers are found not to comply with publishing policies, they somehow must be flagged and excluded from future peer review processes. And the policies should be in place, but they should also provide certain concrete steps that need to be taken in order to ensure that something can be proved or not proved. Otherwise, of course, this can put the journal's or the publisher's reputation at risk, but even most importantly, this can compromise the integrity and ethics of the peer review system. So in a nutshell, and it's strange because both previous speakers actually touched upon this and had a similar opinion about this, the truth is that everybody wants to publish, but nobody has time to review. And as AI tools become better and better, the manuscripts written by AI tools will become better, and the review reports will even become better. Also, with the recent release of deep research, for example, by OpenAI, it is even more evident now that papers will be written by AI tools, and they will be also reviewed by AI tools, which leads to a complete loss of the meaning of the peer review process, which is to critically assess the novelty, quality, and impact of research by peer experts. So my intervention was based on a personal experience that I had as an editor, and this is published in Research Ethics in early 2024. And since then, I could see that similar articles emerged describing the same problem. So this is not something rare, and definitely this is something that should be addressed during the peer review process. So thank you very much.
Thanks again for keeping the time very sharp. Stay here. We'll wait for the two next come over for the next presentation to go for the question. So there have been three presentations showing all the prompts. There we have seen that we may lose the author, we may lose the reader, and now we are losing the peer reviewer. So it seems that some authors have done many wrong things with AI, some kind of misuse that you will be showing us. So floor is yours.
Thank you. As it had been said before, I will talk to you about some maybe let's say less nice usage of this kind of technology. We saw some really great uses this morning, but it's, oh, where do I change? Wait. Oh, good. No. But yeah, it's only a tool, so it depends on who uses it for what. So in this presentation, I will talk about some misusage of LLMs and ChatGPT in particular that we found already in the scientific literature with my colleagues, and especially Guillaume Cabanac, that some of you in the room may know. I will go very quickly on the first slide because it's basically what was already presented to you. We are in a context where there is more and more scientific publications coming out. The pressure to publish is definitely has been documented already. And what is also paradoxical in a way is that in some countries, at the moment, we have less and less doctors being trained, and yet we still are in this push to publish more and more. So we definitely have a paradox in terms of the productivity expected of the researchers. So of course, when there is a tool that offers to give you a boost in productivity or some shortcuts, some people might take it. It's only human, but can create some questionable outputs, like we will see. Very quickly, you all know ChatGPT, I guess, especially after all the presentations we had today. I will just point out the timing. So ChatGPT came out in December 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So really at the end of the year. And very quickly, we could observe an impact on the scientific literature in terms of linguistics, if I can say. The words used in the scientific publications changed. So we already know that ChatGPT is used by researchers to write papers. It is a fact. You can see here, so ChatGPT favors some words over others due to the training it has been through. And you can see these words in 2024 that were detected in some abstract, way more than they have been ever before. So first fact, ChatGPT is used to write, in part, papers by researchers. The problem, of course, is when the use is not, I would say, well thought of, or that researchers don't check the output. We talked about the risk and the hallucinations of these kind of models. So of course, you would expect people to read what the model gives them. Unfortunately, we found some pretty disturbing stuff in some published papers. So in the first generation of ChatGPT, you had a little button that said regenerate response. So you asked him a question, and if you were not happy, you could click on the button and he would reformulate or give you another response. And this regenerate response has been found, unfortunately, in some published articles. So when I say that the people did not read what the model was giving to them, it's very literal. They copy-pasted in the article, including the button, which is funny, but not so funny. It's always a challenge when you work on this kind of topics. So you see here, regenerate response. It's even a little title, of a paragraph. Okay, and the problem is that these kind of examples, we found several. We found also, some dead giveaway phrases. ChatGPT will often tell you when you ask him a question, as an AI language model, I cannot do this or that. You know, it's just explaining his limitation or its limitations, I should say. And we found also this kind of, you know, giveaway phrases in some published articles, including in some very well-renowned journals. You see here in a journal with an impact factor of more than 10. So impact factor can be, you know, discussed, of course, and debated, but it is supposed to show some sort of quality. You know, you have more trust normally as a researcher. If you're reading a journal with a high impact factor, you say, okay, the peer review will be done diligently, and, you know, people will have spent time on this article. And yet, when you find this, please note that as an AI language model, what do you think of the rest of the article? It raises questions about the quality of the article in itself, but also the editorial process that led to this article being published, like what was presented before. You know, it's the whole review process that gets questioned then when you find these kind of things in an article. There is a researcher, Alex Glynn, that has a website that is kind of gathering these all these examples. If you want to have a closer look, it's called Academ.ai. Never know how to pronounce that. But you can see he already has 700 examples of these kind of things. And it also impacts big editors. It's not only, you know, a small editor that no one reads. Normally, it's things like IEEE, Elsevier, Springer Nature. So we have these big editors, you know, selling normally what is supposed to be qualitative articles, because it's their business. They are selling them, but they are selling articles that contain these kind of artifacts, if we can say. Certainly, here are some potential highlights for your paper. Thank you, but should that be in a published article? It raises definitely a lot of questions. These kind of problems. We talked about peer review just before. We also find this kind of problems in peer reviews. So definitely, we know that yes, some reviewers are using ChatGPT to review papers, despite the fact that normally in for majority of the editors, it's forbidden. We know they do. We have a regenerate response just in the middle of the report. And same thing that I said before about the abstract, we can see the words, you know, shifting in the reviews. We see some terms used by ChatGPT becoming more prominent. So we know it is done. But at the moment, we are really, I would say in a gray zone, not for the regenerate response. The regenerate response is not in a gray zone. It's in a black zone, should not happen. But, you know, we know that peer reviewers are using ChatGPT. Are they then looking critically at what the model is giving them or not? That's another question that I think needs to be discussed at the very least. We talked also a lot today about hallucinations. Of course, we know these models hallucinate, and they are also very good, in hallucinating, if I can say, but in generating convincing scientific citations. You see here some researchers that did a little experiment. They try to do basically state-of-the-art with ChatGPT, and they gave really precise, a precise question. I want to have some publication for these authors. They work on these themes. What can you give me? And all the references ChatGPT gave them were non-existent. They were all hallucinations. And so we know it can happen in theory. The problem is it also happened in the scientific literature. This publication was retracted because 1/4 of all its references, 25% almost, were hallucinated. When the editor was alerted and checked the references, they could not find 25% of them. So here again, and it's, you know, +1, it's not a small journal, it's not a not well-known journal. So here again, it raises the response of the question of what happened behind the scenes for this article to be accepted, both on the author side, the reviewers, and the editors' side. Images, same problem. I will go quite quickly, but these were found in scientific publications, like the example that was shared, you know, before. This has no place in a scientific publication. It's not even real words. In some of them, you have daughter cottoned, patient cottoned. I don't know what they wanted to say, but this has no place in a scientific publication, and yet it was published. Of course, the more global question here is the problematic with the paper mills. So paper mills, of course, are private companies, if you can say, that sell a number of services, including fully written articles to researchers that want to be a little quicker, let's say, in their publication output. And they, you know, put some real ads. Literally, you can buy some papers. Here you have a $50 promotion on this one. So, you know, and the question is now, what can they do with these kind of models, of course? So I will finish very quickly with some positive notes. So we know this is a problem, but there are some initiatives taking place to try to, you know, combat the paper mills. So there is a Unity 2 Act that was put in place in May 2023. So, you know, highlighting the problem of the paper mills and trying to gather the different stakeholders to work together against this menace for the scientific literature. And the researchers working on these topics are more and more recognized for their work. Here you can see Anna Abalkina was thanked, if I can say, recognized by Nature last year as one of the 10 of you know, Nature's 10 scientists of the year for her work on paper mills. So there is hope, but it's still definitely a problematic that need to be in mind for, I think, everyone working in science at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for ending with a bright perspective, because, well, it was not a really good session. Well, at least the one thing is that it's not now that AI will replace researchers. I think we can agree on that. So I assume now we have a bright light inside, because, well, editor is considering the use of AI and the misuse of AI. So let's see. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here. Yeah, so I'll be talking about how AI is used at, and not used, at Taylor and Francis, where I now work, and sort of the benefits and challenges that we see and experience. So just a quick back. So up until January, or before January, I spent my sort of spare time investigating research fraud, research integrity problems. The advert for the sale of authorship that Ophélie just showed was my find, and enables quite a lot of retractions due to finding problems and identifying problems in those papers. But yeah, since January, I have been working for Taylor and Francis as part of a team of research integrity people. They already had a team. It did not start in January, but it's growing. And so I'm now sort of get to see behind the curtain and see all of the things that are not published, as well as, you know, the things that are. So, I mean, this has been covered sort of quite a lot already today, but it's to say that when people talk about AI, they can refer to a number of things, and a lot of things have become AI, which did not used to be called AI, but AI is the current buzzword, the exciting word, the thing that companies want to say to their investors to encourage things. So, but you know, neural networks, machine learning, which have been around for quite a while, and then more recently, generative AI and all sorts of things that people have been talking about today. And yeah, recent concerns about AI have really focused on generative AI. No one, I think, was really particularly concerned about AI when people were using neural networks to diagnose cancer in X-rays or MRIs of lungs or something. No one was concerned about AI when it was doing that, but particularly in the kinds of science publishing and science, it's when we're thinking about generative AI, where people are creating text, they are creating images, and we don't know what is real anymore. We don't know who has done what. There's ChatGPT, Claude, Grok. People keep coming out with new ones and different versions, 01, version 4, whatever. So how does Taylor and Francis use AI? So I would say sparingly. We do not use generative AI in any way. There is, but we do use a few software packages or services that use AI, again, in some definition of AI in some way. And all of these are commercial pieces of software. They are proprietary. So they don't say exactly what they're doing behind the scenes. So I can't say exactly how they use AI and how much that is there. Again, them trying to sell a product by saying they are using AI, and how much they're doing something which actually 5 years ago would just be called an algorithm. Okay, but so the editorial team of Taylor and Francis use something called PaperPal Preflight. So any submission that's sent to Taylor and Francis sort of gets fed into that, and it's performing a checklist. It's if this journal requires an ethical statement, does this paper contain an ethical statement? Sort of tick. Perhaps does the title match the guidelines of titles for this journal? Yes, no. So it's basically going through a checklist, and some things I imagine are pretty simple, and some things maybe do need a language or are improved by having a language model in there as well. But it's just going through a checklist. We use Turnitin for plagiarism checking, as so many universities use as well. And again, Turnitin says it has an AI in there somewhere. Okay, so again, what does that mean? I don't know. But so we use that for plagiarism checking, and we use a piece of software called Image Twin, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not, which is essentially a plagiarism checker for images. But not just these two images are identical, but this image is the same as this one in another paper from 2 years ago, which is a mirror and rotated, or this part of this image is the same as this part of this image. And so we use that not for every paper, but when we have suspicions, either before publication, or if someone has, put one of our papers on PubPeer and said, I have found these problems with the images, we will go and check, and we will use Image Twin primarily for that checking. And so you can also check things here. Authorship, automatic checks. Does this does this person exist? Does this institution exist? So again, is pretty tricky. But I think a really important thing for Taylor and Francis, and I think I would hope for most publishers, but most people, to be honest, is that the AI must never make a decision, right? So that checklist, does this have an ethical statement? Yes, no. Is the title correct? Yes, no. If it says, no, it's not just automatically put in the bin, right? So a person must check if the AI or the bit of software is correct. And we have to have that human check. The AI must never make a decision. The AI flags, a human evaluates and decides. So yeah, this is Image Twin. It's amazing. There used to be a handful of people in the world, I would say. I mean, I'd say maybe even fewer than that. Many of you may have heard of Elizabeth Bick, a woman who is able sort of just with her own eyes to spot things like this. But I've tried many times to look at some of the things that she has highlighted, and I absolutely can never see it unless they are sort of totally identical and next to each other. And yet she would find things like this by eye. But Image Twin does it for mortals, like the rest of us. And so here we have duplications from within one paper or within one figure. These are all supposed to be different conditions, different experimental conditions, different time points or things. So, and I mean, it's biological. We are not expecting these things to be identical or to be matching regions, and yet there are. So this would be, again, we would always, again, a human would check, whether they agree with Image Twin's diagnosis. But I would say in this case, I agree with Image Twin's diagnosis. And so that is one of the ways, a very beneficial use of AI. And an Image Twin is using, I think, nothing generative, it's clever machine learning, but it's very clever. So, and now problems of AI. So, generative AI, so now we're talking specifically generative AI, used sensibly is not detectable, right? So none of your regenerate response as an AI language model, right? There is, Vicky said, use the AI detector, that they do not exist, or they do not exist reliably. Now, AI images have a style, and some of you may have seen this before. I will not linger on it. But yeah, there is no way to detect AI-generated text. Anyone who says they can, turn it in, says they can. But the problem is you accuse people of using AI who have not used AI. There are many false positives, and no author wants to be told that their paper is AI-generated when it's not. No one wants their peer review to be rejected because it's the computer says it is AI generated, and actually they wrote it themselves. And the problem is that this has already destroyed trust between editors, authors, and reviewers. So this is a recent peer review that which was I had to look at because this came to the ethics team, where the reviewer was convinced that the manuscript they were looking at had large chunks of AI text, and they said, they came up with an example of a mistake that was in the paper, but they were convinced that a human could not make this mistake. The mistake must be from ChatGPT or an AI, and so they basically refused to review it in any more detail. They just said, this is AI. Why did you send this to me? They were insulted. The problem is there was no, their reasoning is not correct, or certainly they could not be certain. And there is no evidence in the paper that this paper was generated by ChatGPT. Sort of neither of us could know. But because it's now possible for the paper to be generated by ChatGPT, the reviewer, they think something is off and they assume can't be human error, it must be ChatGPT. And we see the same thing with authors saying, this review, I think, is from ChatGPT, so get me another review. So in conclusion, AI can be useful to publishers, particularly in error detection, plagiarism detection, image manipulation detection. But it also creates big challenges. There are no ways to detect AI-generated text as much as we would wish them to be. And it really has sort of destroyed trust in the process. I would say, yeah, but so AI must never make a decision. We have to keep a human assessing the outputs. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much. And please come over here. So we have now a few minutes. I hope you have kept your questions behind you. So yeah, all the questions are.
So I was talking about.
C'est bon.
Okay. So I was talking about a journal from Learned Society, like American Physical Society. They have now journals which are the old ones, but for American Society have not PRX, where you have to pay to publish there. And so they sort of left somehow like commercial report and some sense. But they were never mentioned not to have specific reason, or was it just sandbox?
I mean, I was fairly restricted in talking about papers from Taylor and Francis, but I can say that there are paper mills and people will try and publish in any venue they can, which they think is, well, prestigious or equally is a paper. Yeah. And certainly the American Chemical Society is definitely has papers with problems, as do other societies. And yeah, ChatGPT and AI is going to be used, I'm sure, for those journals as much as it is for other publishers or societies.
Just want to make a quick compliment to that answer, is that the retraction rates of journals goes up as a function of the impact factor. Which, of course, if you are to commit fraud, better do it in Science or Nature than in a local journal. But of course, these journals are also more stringent. Papers that are going to be published there, the entire community will look at them. So there's kind of a trade-off there, but Nick is right. There's going to be crap everywhere, unfortunately.
So I'm sorry, we have time for one last question. No,
Okay.
we have time? Okay. Okay, so a few more questions.
Hello, I have one question. You spoke about the trust which has been destroyed between the authors and the peer reviewers, but are there some studies as well about the trust from the reader's side? Is there a destruction of the trust from the readers as well? Well, you just said that there are no readers left, but if there are some readers left, do they trust what they read?
I'm certainly not aware of any study. I don't know if the the academics in the room may know.
I don't know of any study that looked at it yet. I mean, it's quite recent, so maybe some people are working on it, but I didn't see yet any results on this specific topic. But it's true that I've been doing this talk several times since December of last year, and there is definitely always a feedback of, some people are getting quite anxious about, how do I know that the paper I'm reading is qualitative? There is so many possible fraud now that how do I know? So it's true that it is probably having an impact, definitely, on the reader's trust, because we know that it is possible for an article to be, in fact, not what you think it is. But yeah, I mean, there is not much to say except in the vast majority, scientific literature remains sound and qualitative. That's important to have in mind. I didn't have time to say the number in my slide, but currently the paper mill production it's probably a low estimate because it's on what we identified as paper mill, but it's around 1.5% of the scientific production. It's way too much because due to the volume, it's still a lot of articles, but it's still definitely a small part of the global scientific literature. So I think it's important to remind, to keep that in mind, that vast majority of scientific literature remains qualitative, and do your best to have a critical thinking when you are reading an article.
I just want to complement that. So I think you're right, and I think most scientists are able to flag bad quality papers because we're the reviewers. So I don't need peer review or a journal to tell me whether it's good or bad. But for the general public, it's an issue, and for practitioners. So people who are using science for their, be it medical doctors, teachers, etc. For those who are used to trust scientific literature as something that was vetted by the experts, that is a huge problem. And we don't necessarily have data on whether scientists are less trusty or trust less their colleagues, but we definitely know that society trusts less science. And so even if this is not directly related, this definitely will not improve the current relation between science and society.
So we have also Vicky online. If you don't hesitate if you want to answer. I think we still have time for one question. Yeah. Okay. Well, everything was clear now. One question over here.
Yes, if there is no question in the room, I may have one. So it's about the impact factor and everything about those quantitative evaluation metrics. So I would want to play a bit of the devil advocate, that they are very useful to quickly find where to publish, and because they are supposed to be a proxy for quality. So if we take them out, we need to find another proxy for quality. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So do you have in mind some of alternatives that would work, that will be useful as proxy for quality?
That's a good point, because in many ways, when you look at the Web of Science, which is a database that compiled impact factor, there's no journals or very, very few journals that have been considered as predatory included in there. And journals that have been found to have, let's say, deviant citation practices were excluded from having an impact factor. But still, we know that there's soft manipulations that are happening with the journal impact factor. There's some of the three, let's say, more debatable open access publishers that I won't name, that have journal impact factor that are pretty high. Even if when you read the paper as an expert, you would be, oh, that's a bit surprising. So in many ways, unfortunately, the journal impact factor is getting less and less good at flagging good journals. Keeping also in mind that impact factors within a field will follow a skewed distribution. There's going to be 5 or 10 journals that are definitely above the rest. But it's a long tail where the bottom of Q1 is actually more similar to Q4 in terms of quartiles than it is to the top of Q1. So I don't have there's no alternative to that, but there's one general, I would say, learning lesson from that, is that there's probably too many papers that are being published. So my point would be to try to stop that at the source, but that is not easy, and that means reshaping our research evaluation ecosystems.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, so just yeah.
So I don't have an alternative. I mean, I guess it used to be you read the papers, and there were enough papers, or not too many papers, that you could read. You would read that edition of the journal, and you would have a feel for how good the journal was, because you were assessing all the papers in there. Obviously, no one can read all the papers in their field now, basically. I would say, again, now working for Taylor and Francis, seeing impact factors are boosted in many ways. And I am investigating editors and editors-in-chief who tell authors that they need to cite this many papers, suggest that they should cite, they may wish to cite these 10 papers from the journal from the last 2 years, or they should cite some papers from the journal in the last 2 years. So, and I'm sure it is happening everywhere. So impact factor is gamed in all sorts of ways.
So yeah, before going on the last questions, we wanted to point quickly to the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, COARA, which suggests that the evaluation should be made on the article disrespectfully of its venue. So whatever the journal, look at the article and read it. That was it. Okay, thank you very much again for everybody.